Welcome to this evening's edition of Tysky Sour. We were meant to have a show earlier on. Sadly, we couldn't. Nevertheless, we've got, I think, 5 shows this week, which is pretty impressive. My name's Aaron Bastani. Tonight I have the great pleasure of being joined by author and investigative reporter Phil Miller. How you doing, Phil?
Very good. Thanks, Aaron.
Good. Late last month, Phil published his first book with Pluto Press. It's called Keenie Meenie, The British Mercenaries Who Got Away with War Crimes. And I'm just going to read an excerpt from the top of the book, if that's okay. We need to get this up, maybe. It'd be great. And it lays out really what the book's all about, far more succinctly than we probably could live on air. Profiting from war is one of the most controversial aspects of UK foreign policy. The debate normally centres on why British bombs are being sold to a belligerent ally and how the deal was secured. However, the arms industry will always defend its businesses on the grounds its staff never pull the trigger, and that any subsequent casualties are therefore not its responsibility. Or, as the chairman of Britain's largest arms dealer, BAE Systems, modestly told shareholders in 2019, we provide defence equipment that ultimately encourages peace. Tenuous as that logic may sound, amid this heated debate on the arms trade, it is often forgotten that there is another British industry altogether, which has absolutely no qualms about being directly involved in war. Mercenaries will deliver the bullet directly to their client's target of choice, and the UK is one of the world's largest networks of private armies. British mercenaries can be embroiled in conflicts without much accountability than their firm filing an annual report at Companies House, where they're often required to list the region of the planet in which their, quote, security consultants operated that year, be it Africa, Asia, or Latin America. So that lays it out, I think, really, really well, in so much as the discussion on the left is always talking about, in so much as it does talk about foreign policy, is talking about arms sales, BAE Systems to Yemen, to Saudi Arabia, to Turkey. And what this book highlights in real crystal clear detail, it's a case study of a particular firm called Keenie Meenie Services, is that there's this whole other industry, which is often neglected. If it sounds like I'm talking a lot, that's because I am. Before we do go to Phil, we're going to watch a trailer for the book, which again really just conveys things really quickly, and we can kick the conversation off after that.
When I was in the Special Air Service, everyone knew about KMS. Keenie Meenie Services. It's just a term used by soldiers for people who are very keen and nasty.
They were not official government, they were a private firm, mostly from the ex-SAS. Well, I think they killed people, basically.
As he flew over the area, his door gunner opened up and shot every man, woman, child and animal that he could get his eyes on.
A whole bloody lot had been dropped on the Tamils with grenades inside them.
I think there are equities that belong to other governments that are at stake here.
There were one or two British politicians who were connected to the company.
இந்த கம்பெனிக்கு இந்த பிரிட்டிஷ் கவர்மெண்ட்டும் ஒரு ஆதரவாக இருக்குன்னு நினைக்க அதிர்ச்சி அளிக்குது.
I wasn't happy with the role that I was being asked to fulfill. There were a lot of undercurrents that were immoral.
Hello, Lieutenant Colonel Beatty.
Bugger off.
Do you accept any personal responsibility for war crimes that were committed in Sri Lanka, sir?
You're on my land. Get out.
It's a great trailer.
Thank you.
And the film of the book is coming out when?
Probably end of April, early May. At film festivals, and then we'll do a wider release later in the year.
And that's going to keep this, I guess, relevant because...
Yeah, so a lot of the interviews in the book we filmed on camera with my colleagues from Yardstick Films, and so there's some quite chilling bits when you hear what people involved in this enterprise have to say for themselves.
So before we get into who Keenie Meenie Services are, the particularities of the book, what catalysed you into writing it? What inspired you? Because it's obviously quite an obscure, as you state right at the beginning of the book, quite an obscure part of the foreign policy debate in this country.
Yeah, the first time I heard about Keenie Meenie Services was back in around, I think, 2011. I was at university. I was in a group that visited asylum seekers in detention centres, and there was a whole group of Tamil asylum seekers who were being deported to Sri Lanka. And when they were sent back, some of them were tortured, and the Home Office kept sending Tamils back on these flights. So I was very kind of shocked and surprised at that stage that Britain would be sending people to a country where they knew they were going to be tortured. And I was speaking to a Tamil activist who had come here in the 80s, and he mentioned the name of this company to me, the Keenie Meenie Services, and he said, they're not just deporting us, they also sent mercenaries to try and kill us at the start of the conflict in Sri Lanka. So that really intrigued me, and there wasn't much that I could find about the company. And I went on to work for Corporate Watch, investigating private security companies involved in detention and deportation. But I kept my eye out for anything on Keenie Meenie, and there's a law in the UK that says after 30 years the government has to declassify its files. So by this point, it was like 30 years since the company had started working in Sri Lanka. So I went to the National Archives and started to find like a handful of files referring to Keenie Meenie. And I just kind of kept like digging away from that point. More and more information was being declassified, and also the files were like naming some of the diplomats and like defence attachés who were involved. So then I was able to trace them, and some of them agreed to speak to me and do interviews.
Was the company, for want of a better word, innovative in the sector? Because obviously private security contractors, Blackwater, etc., in the 21st century have become a huge business. But as you say, it's only a few decades ago that states had a real monopoly on violence.
Yep.
So were these guys, were they quite groundbreaking? Did they come out of an era when all of a sudden this was quite a new industry?
Yeah, they blazed like a trail of creative destruction. That's probably the kindest way of putting it. So you have like, if you go really far back, you have like the East India Company, which was used at the start of the British imperial project to kind of, colonize and conquer India and other parts of the world. And then when the empire became too big for private companies to handle, the Crown stepped in and directly, used direct British military force to keep these places under occupation. And what we see with Keenie Meenie was in a period in the 70s when the British Empire was kind of breaking up to a large degree, and there was like a generation of soldiers who all they knew was kind of counterinsurgency and how to keep control of parts of the world, and they used their skills on the private market in a way that allowed the British government to say, okay, Sri Lanka's independent, but to keep a very strong hand in the country's internal affairs and to make sure that the Tamil minority weren't able to get an independent state, which was their aspiration. So
prior to Keenie Meenie being set up, when were they set up precisely?
It's around the mid-1970s, 1975.
Yeah. And around then you have, was it 16 British mercenaries were arrested in Angola?
Yes.
Well, not just British, Rhodesian, etc., but white mercenaries arrested in Angola fighting against, was it Savimbi?
Yeah, so they were fighting against the MPLA.
MPLA, that's right, and sort of leftist guerrillas. Can you just sort of go into that a little bit? What happened
so
to them?
This was like a slightly earlier generation of mercenaries who didn't even have like a company structure. And some of the Keenie Meenie guys had done a similar thing in Yemen, where it was kind of like this mercenary and his mates, and he ran it out of the basement of his house in Chelsea. But in Angola, they were fighting against left-wing forces, and one of the mercenary commanders massacred a group of his own men, and this caused a scandal in the UK. The fact that not so much that British mercenaries were fighting in Angola, but that they were killing themselves, seemed to be the issue, and it led to a debate in Parliament where Harold Wilson kind of raised the question of whether there should be a ban on mercenaries, and it was a kind of a really interesting debate because you had both people on the right and the left of British politics arguing to some extent for the right of people being able to go abroad and fight. There were some people who referred to the left-wing groups that went to fight in Spain, against Franco, and then there were also some very reactionary conservative MPs who said, we should have the right to go and fight against Soviets wherever they are in the world. But then that debate was kind of put into, it was given to Lord Diplock, a judge, to do a kind of study of how Britain should handle mercenaries, and he consulted the Foreign Office and MOD, and the response he got was really interesting because they said, well, look, we have things like Gurkhas, which we use a lot, so a ban on mercenaries. These are soldiers from Nepal who fight in the British Army.
Significant numbers of them, right?
Yeah.
More than, 1,500 serving right now, I think, in the British Army? Or you talk about the numbers, I think, here.
Yeah, it's large. And back then it was even more. Large numbers of Gurkhas. And also the Foreign Office piped up and said, well, there's a company we use called Keenie Meenie Services, who are the only company that we trust to guard our bodyguards in conflict zones around the world. And a ban on mercenaries could actually put that company out of business. And it also provides bodyguards for various rulers in the Middle East who we support and wouldn't want to be seen to be taking away their bodyguards from. And it's so that led to basically no domestic ban on mercenaries. And that legal vacuum, which I argue was kind of deliberately created, led to a situation where, particularly in the 80s, under Thatcher and Reagan, with more aggressive anti-communism, Keenie Meenie was really able to escalate its activities. So it went from being bodyguards to, in the most extreme case in Sri Lanka, flying helicopter gunships and pulling the trigger against Tamil civilians.
So let's just look at the sort of political economy again. I think it's something you do very well in the book. You're saying demise the British Empire, large groups of men with skills, very skilled in counterinsurgency, and then all these new incipient nation states, Sri Lanka being one, who don't have the same kind of competencies, don't have these institutions, they're not ready to go. So that's a great business opportunity. And then I think what you do really well in the book is say this kind of intersects with the whole neoliberal agenda of the early 1980s, and it just puts it on steroids. Your book focuses specifically on not just Sri Lanka, but also Oman and Nicaragua. I guess for the purpose of this book, we're going to focus primarily on Sri Lanka, because it's the most egregious example. But could you just explain briefly the role of KMS in Oman, for instance?
Yeah. So Oman is a country that has a huge amount of British involvement, but hardly any media coverage. So in 1970, there's a left-wing uprising against the Sultan of Oman, and the British realise that he's about to lose, so they overthrow him and put his son on the throne, Qaboos. And over the next 6 years, the SAS helped to crush the rebellion to a large degree, but there's still a kind of hardcore group left who still have arms caches and still want to overthrow the Sultan. And so Keenie Meenie come in and they set up a unit called the Sultan Special Forces, which is basically Oman's SAS. It's based in the middle of Dhofar, which is the most rebellious part of Oman. And this unit has very close links with a guy called Tim Landon, who's known as the White Sultan of Oman. He's basically a former British Army officer who was the Sultan's right-hand man, or even kind of puppet master, certainly in the early periods of his rule. And there are hints from the file that Keenie Meenie was this unit they set up in Oman, did carry out some kind of raids on arms caches and operations in Dhofar going right into the late 80s. And their successor company, Saladin, as late as 1997, seemed to be operating there. And, the point of what the company did was to keep the Sultan in power. He stayed in power until January this year when he died, so he ruled for half a century.
Flags in Downing Street were at half-mast, I believe, or Buckingham Palace or whatever, Clarendon House.
Boris Johnson and Prince Charles rushed out to Oman. This was in the middle of, Prince Harry kind of stepping down from the royal family. Prince Charles found time to fly out to Oman to kind of usher in the Sultan's successor, who's his cousin, who was basically chosen in an envelope that the Sultan left. So there was no democratic process, and that just shows how Britain is keen to maintain dictatorships in part of the Middle East when they support British agenda. They're British oil companies in Oman that get lots of royalties from the country's oil.
Before we go any further, you're watching Tiski Sour on Novara Media. My name's Aaron Bastani. We're joined by the excellent Phil Miller. Views aren't normally what they'd be like because we're doing every night this week, so people are expecting shows on specific nights. However, you can help us push up the audience numbers. The link for the show is in the description. If you think more people should know about Britain's involvement in places like Oman, Sri Lanka, Nicaragua, I personally think they should. I think most people would be outraged if they knew about these things. That's why Phil spent, 7 years writing this. Not easy. Very, very good book. Then share the link on the hashtag Tiski Sour. What's more, if you want to see some of our more recent content, we did a great interview, I think, with Rebecca Long-Bailey last night. That is on the YouTube channel. I think maybe you can see details of that. Maybe they're beneath me, they're above me, I don't know. You can see them. Very, very good interview. We really went to town on pretty much every question. Scotland, LGBT rights, the Green New Deal, electability, her colleagues, how she would discipline the party, everything, non-stop, like a Gatling gun, for an hour. Very good interview, much recommended again. If you think it's worth sharing, hashtag Tiski Sour. Back to tonight's show. Let's talk about Sri Lanka, because I think Sri Lanka and Oman are really, really great case studies, because if you're looking at the militarization of the domestic state apparatus, it's not even sort of pushed on by the British state. Like you say, there's this weird dynamic of private military interests or private security interests, the British state, with plausible deniability, and then these sort of domestic elites. In the case of Sri Lanka, and obviously Oman, it sort of dealt with this uprising. It was nothing like what happened with the Tamil insurgency. Can you just talk about the sort of creation of its domestic anti-terror apparatus? What comparison organisations do they have to the SAS? What's their police look like?
Yeah, so in Sri Lanka, the ordinary police wear a kind of like a brown khaki coloured uniform. They wear like a blue kind of like police commander hat, and a lot of them are armed. So they kind of look like colonial police officers. And then what Keenie Meenie did was they set up like a paramilitary police unit. So it's kind of supposedly part of the police, but if you saw them in the street, they look like soldiers, and not just any soldiers, but kind of very elite soldiers. So the unit prides itself on its physical fitness, on its gymnastic ability, and it has the best weapons.
And what's its name?
It's called the Special Task Force.
Yep.
And so this is kind of a pattern of what Keenie Meenie seemed to do around the world. They'd set up these very elite special forces units that specialised in, counter-revolutionary warfare. And yeah, this unit, although it was supposed to be very professional, what I do in the book is I kind of trace its track record while it's being trained by the British mercenaries. So the British mercenaries were like the chief instructor at the training camp. And what I find is that the massacres, like the civilian death toll, goes up the longer that they're being trained by Keenie Meenie. So you start with a massacre of about 12 civilians, and after 3 years of training, you have a massacre of about 85
So
civilians.
what years are we looking at here?
So this is from like 1984, which is pretty much the start of the Sri Lankan Civil War, to like 1987, over that 3-year period. And in the context of Sri Lanka, like that massacre of 85 people, which was at a prawn farm, was like at the time one of the worst massacres. Obviously, since then, the violence has escalated, and you have far larger massacres taking place. But at the time, that was one of the worst ones for the Tamil community. It led to a lot of Tamil refugees coming to the UK. It led to the immigration minister at the time going to Sri Lanka on a fact-finding mission to see if it was safe to send Tamils back. When he went there, Tamils told him, that the Special Task Force is given to terrifying displays of military might. And he said he thinks the answer is for more training from Keenie Meenie, not less. So you see the kind of support there from Britain's immigration minister. At this point, Tamil refugees were being put in a ship that was anchored off the east coast. and in Harmondsworth Detention Centre as well. So you see the evolution of like the detention centre apparatus as well running in parallel in response to these refugee crises, which British mercenaries had a hand in stoking up.
So people would look at G4S, they'd look at Blackwater, they'd look at Serco administering domestic detention centres, and they think this is all quite new. I mean, and to an extent it is.
In some ways, yeah.
But the genesis of it really could be traced back to these guys in the mid-80s.
Definitely, yeah. I think they kind of showed the limits of what you could get away with, and the private security industry now tries to draw this line between offensive combat operations and like self-defense. So they would argue, okay, we'll give like armed guards to a convoy that we know is driving out to an outpost in the middle of a conflict zone. So it's kind of inevitable that it's going to come under fire. But their view is, well, we'll only open fire if we're fired upon. We're going to defend the convoy. But they know that they're in a combat zone and they are going to have to engage in fighting. But they kind of draw this line between offensive and defensive, which actually, I mean, Keenie Meenie tried to do this as well. They'd say, well, you know, our helicopter pilots only open fire if they're fired upon. Of course, they were also going further than that. But then the Foreign Office lawyers, you see from the declassified files, say, you know, this is an incredibly fine line that this distinction you're trying to draw.
And what was the political overhead? Because, of course, you've got India as a major power.
Yeah.
Less so then than now, but still, you know, it was a nuclear power in the mid-80s,
yeah.
I think more or less. Obviously close ties to the United Kingdom. What did they make of sort of a British business behaving like this? Was there any sort of political consequences for the Tories who were in government at the time?
Yeah, so at that time, India was one of the largest customers of British weapons. So it was up there with Saudi Arabia and the US in the 1980s. And India was supporting the Tamil movement. So Britain didn't want to upset their relationship with India because it didn't want these arms sales and other trade deals to fall through. So one of Margaret Thatcher's top advisors said, well, perhaps we could privatise the support that we give to the Sri Lankan military. So Sri Lanka's president had asked for serving British soldiers to go out and help him. And the British felt that would, you know, really upset India. You know, the old colonial power was meddling in its next door neighbour. So they decided to privatise it, and that's when you start to see from the declassified files, Keenie Meenie emerges, and is very readily accepted by the Sri Lankan president.
There's people in the comments. One comment is the book an easy read? And I mean, it's 270 pages, something like that. And I'm interviewing Anthony Lowenstein tomorrow about the war on drugs. We were just talking about this before the show, and that's also investigative reportage. But you know, I'm always, that's an interesting thing. Let's look at the footnotes. And in this book, it's archive material, interviews. I mean, it's just a phenomenal piece of scholarship, which you would think makes it a less interesting read. It doesn't, purely because of the vignettes and the characters and the stories. That's not a good thing, obviously. We'll talk about some of the characters shortly. Nicaragua, as you meant to pronounce it. We talked about Oman, Sri Lanka. What was Keenie Meenie's involvement in Nicaragua at the time? Obviously, a key focus of not just the Cold War, but sort of Reagan's wars abroad in the mid-80s.
Yeah, so at this time, Nicaragua had a democratically elected left-wing government that was despised by Ronald Reagan and Thatcher. And so there was a covert operation by this very hawkish US Marine Colonel, Oliver North, to overthrow the government of Nicaragua, and Keenie Meenie became embroiled in this plot. And the kind of most serious thing that they did was, or are alleged to have done, is there was a hospital in the capital of Nicaragua which exploded one night, and it later emerged in a US congressional hearing that Keenie Meenie supposedly had been involved in orchestrating that attack on a hospital in Nicaragua. They also supplied pilots as well to the Contras, who were the US-backed guerrillas who were trying to overthrow the democratically elected government. And there's lots of talk of trying to get surface-to-air missiles for the Contras as well. I mean, this was the thing with Keenie Meenie, is they would, in some conflicts, if they were working for the government, you know, they'd be flying helicopter gunships. In other conflicts, if they were working for the guerrillas, they'd be trying to shoot down, you know, advising them how to shoot down helicopter gunships. The consistent thing was whether it was like a right-wing group, that's who they would support.
So there was an ideological element to it. It wasn't just
Definitely.
quote unquote business.
Yeah, no, they still would come down kind of on the side of Western interests. And that's often why they were tolerated in Sri Lanka, particularly because Britain wanted to keep the Soviets out of Sri Lanka. There's a harbour called Trincomalee Harbour that is a very strategic harbour in the Indian Ocean. So Britain's ambassador was worried that if Britain didn't offer some kind of help, then they'd end up with a Russian military team in Sri Lanka.
And towards the end of the book, you even talk about one of the people involved in Keenie Meenie. He wants to sort of get out, and there are it's the kind of emigre community of Tamils have gone to South India. They're sort of trying to, fight back.
Yeah.
And they try and hire him.
Yeah,
there's a great phrase. I think you say he's gone from sort of mercenary to sort of third world freedom fighter.
Yeah.
And you say that somebody has a word from the government or from the Foreign Office, which kind of compounds what you just said.
Yeah, so this guy worked for Keenie Meenie and then he quit because he was disgusted at what they were involved in. And then there was an approach from the Tamil side to see, I don't know how sincere the approach was, but to see whether he could give them some assistance. And he says, some men in grey suits came and told him, if you do that, we'll make sure you never work again. And I said, who are these men in grey suits? And he's like, the people from the Foreign Office. So yeah, clearly it would have been against Britain's political interests in Sri Lanka for the British to be backing the Tamils.
And what's hugely interesting, I mean, we can talk about this perhaps a bit later on, is that you've obviously got British nationals going abroad to fight for the YPG.
Yep.
Now, I can understand the argument which says, well, you're arresting people that are going to fight for ISIS or any one of the sort of panoply of groups in Syria. And I understand you have to sort of treat them, sort of equally under the law. Obviously, I think the YPG are freedom fighters. I don't agree with, al-Nusra or with ISIS, but I can maybe understand the argument. But as you demonstrate over the course of this book, I mean, there was a gentleman who was a Conservative councillor at the same time as being involved in Keenie Meenie services, leading a very strange parallel life with the full understanding of the authorities. Can you talk about him? I think his name was David Walker, wasn't it?
Yeah, David Walker was a very senior member of Keenie Meenie, who was a Conservative councillor in Surrey from about 1982 to 1986. So I went to the Surrey History Centre in Woking, where they have these amazing books of council minutes, which are incredibly boring to read through. But I found things in there where he was on like a committee against aircraft noise in Surrey, and they were like doing petitions to try and stop helicopters flying over London. At the same time, he's running a mercenary company where his staff are flying helicopter gunships that are massacring Tamil civilians. So it's just this total disconnect between this very respectable life that he lived in Surrey and what his company was doing. And he went to Sri Lanka. He visited these bases where the pilots were. So I mean, he knew
he was involved in it was a genocide, what was going on in Sri Lanka at the time, and he was also this kind of Shire Tory. I sort of reading, particularly David Walker, was probably the most, alongside Tim Landon, the most interesting sort of character. You think, God, this could be a Netflix series. I mean, it wouldn't be believable, would it? Somebody could live such a quiet, civilised, English, idyllic life and at the same time be involved in these kind of reprehensible acts abroad.
Yeah, it is incredible what they got away with. But when you start looking at who their connections were, so the chairman of Keenie Meenie Services, I found that the best man at his wedding was the vice chairman of the Conservative Party. And this guy, he later became a lord. And when the Foreign Office did get a bit nervous over particularly the pilots, instead of putting their concerns in writing, there were several times where they asked this guy to go and chat to his mate to try and say, perhaps can we reduce the number of pilots, or maybe, make sure they don't have British passports.
And these were helicopter pilots that were effectively...
Yeah, so
what were they doing, these pilots?
Yeah, so the company tried to say they're just flying as co-pilots, or they were training the Sri Lankan pilots. But what they were really doing, they were far more experienced than the Sri Lankan pilots. So whenever anything kicked off, they'd almost always take over the controls. These were helicopters which had side gunners who were staffed by the Sinhalese, by the Sri Lankan forces. But they would manoeuvre the helicopters in certain ways to get the best amount of covering fire from the machine guns. They would deliver troops into villages, and they'd see the troops go off and massacre civilians. And some of the helicopters had like pod guns fitted to it, so the pilot could pull the trigger directly. And there's like a war diary that one of the pilots wrote, and you see him kind of slide. Like initially, he's quite appalled at what the Sri Lankans in his helicopter are doing. By the end of it, he's telling them how to, blow away villages.
What was this gentleman's name again?
So his name is Tim Smith.
Yeah.
It's not clear if he's still alive. But he seemed to be quite traumatised by what he'd done.
But this is a war crime. I don't understand. Why would you write an autobiography where you're outlining war crimes? Why hasn't anybody sort of gone to arrest this guy yet?
I know, it's staggering. So he published this book in about 2002, and it seems to have been unnoticed. I can't see any press coverage of it. Yeah. There were some Tamil human rights researchers who picked up on it, and they went to a village in Sri Lanka and they found survivors of a massacre who recalled seeing a white pilot around the time where the declassified files show only KMS pilots were capable of flying helicopters. But why the police didn't then try and put a warrant out for this guy's arrest? I mean, I found him on his army records, so his full name. The MOD must know who that person is if they're paying him a pension, and he confesses to being directly involved in the murder of Tamil civilians.
There's a campaign you need to spearhead them with some British Tamil communities by the sounds of it.
Yeah, so we've got a big event on Sunday at the Indian YMCA at 2:30. Everyone's welcome. And it's being hosted by some great Tamil groups, the Tamil Information Centre and Tamil Solidarity. And this will kind of be the first time discussing the book's findings with the Tamil community in a kind of a big venue. And it will be really interesting to hear what their reaction is to the book's findings and what they want to do about it.
Somebody's just said in the comment, what's the book called?
The book is called Keenie Meenie.
Not this, but I believe. I mean, the book you're referring to, the confession.
It's called The Reluctant Mercenary, although he wasn't that reluctant by the end of it. So he actually he was in Sri Lanka for 6 months, came back to England for a month's leave, and then went back out there again. So knowing full well what he'd be getting involved in. So I'm not sure quite how reluctant he was. But the book is now very expensive. I think it's out of print. And whether someone is trying to buy up the book to try and take it out of circulation, I don't know. But
that's interesting.
It's very interesting. And when you compare it with the declassified files, you can kind of match up what he's doing and with what the senior people in
I guess if you think if he's how old, he would be like 75 now, maybe 80 older, maybe I guess I can understand that perhaps. Yeah. Tim Landon, another fascinating character we just mentioned a bit earlier on. The White Sultan of Oman. What's his story?
So Tim Landon went to Sandhurst, the British Army Officer Academy, and one of his batchmates was this young prince from Oman, Qaboos. And they get on very well at Sandhurst, and when they both, Qaboos goes back to Oman, where his father is the Sultan, and Landon goes out there as like a military intelligence officer to help crush the uprising. And he continues his friendship with Qaboos. And when the Foreign Office decide that Qaboos's father is no longer like an effective kind of puppet ruler and needs to be overthrown, Tim Landon's moment kind of steps to the fore. So he goes to the palace with a group of soldiers, and they're involved in kind of deposing the old sultan. And when Qaboos is put on the throne, Landon is his right-hand man. So in return for this, there's rumours that he got something like £1 million every birthday from Qaboos, or a vast share of Oman's oil. He went on to become one of the largest landowners in the UK, and his son was friends with Prince Harry and Prince William. Is he
still alive? Or?
Tim Landon passed away a couple of years back, but right up until his death, Keenie Meenie's successor company, Saladin, was providing him bodyguards. So you can see the kind of his long association with the company.
And you've got this is a quote towards the end of the book about Sultan Qaboos. Fascinating. I saw, because you're declassified, it's okay to say that, isn't it?
Of course, yeah.
Your colleague Mark Curtis was I think, he wrote something about Qaboos, actually, I think in the aftermath of his death. We were told by the BBC we should mourn the passing of this guy. Well, now you know why. Plays quite a significant role in British interests in the region. Here's the quote. Effectively, Oman is virtually still under British rule. What will happen to the country when Qaboos eventually dies remains to be seen. I think we've got 190 soldiers over there at the moment, the British Army.
Yeah.
So that's quite a big statement you're saying, that Oman is virtually still under British rule. How does that work when you've got somebody like Tim Landon? Is it the intersection of private military interests and the British state? And these guys over there, 190 odd soldiers, are they mercenaries even though they're uniformed British soldiers? How does it work?
Yeah. So I wrote, like, as I was writing the book, I was like, oh, some of these characters are probably going to die off. So I think Qaboos died about, like, just as the book had gone to print. But the British state's response was very revealing. So I think the number of soldiers on loan to Oman has gone down slightly since that figure that I had, but it's still, I think, the largest number of British soldiers on loan to foreign armies are in Oman. And we don't know what rank they are, but often these are fairly high-ranking soldiers in important positions in Oman's Ministry of Defence. GCHQ have several stations out in Oman, tapping these undersea cables and that sort of thing. And there's like police training. Today I saw on Twitter the Oman public prosecutor, which is like their version of the CPS, are in London on some kind of training course. This is a country where it's a criminal offence to insult the Sultan. I know someone who helped me do the research on Oman for the book, who was tortured in Oman because he, put things on Facebook criticising the Sultan for corruption. So the idea that we're training their prosecutors in a country where political parties are banned, the only independent newspaper's been shut down, just shows that the British state is willing to help kind of every level of the repressive apparatus in Oman.
That's quite a quotidian thing when people think, we need an ethical foreign policy, we shouldn't sell weapons to these guys. But like you say, it's just an everyday sort of formative part of the British security apparatus working alongside these people. Yeah,
I think Oman really explodes the myth of Britain having a benign foreign policy and caring about human rights. Because it's been a dictatorship for the last 50 years and Britain has supported it continuously. So, I remember when Britain went to war in Iraq, one of the arguments, apart from weapons of mass destruction, was, we're going to bring democracy to the Middle East. If you look at the number of dictators in the Middle East who are British allies, the easiest way to support democracy in the Middle East would be for Britain to actually, with its allies, start talking about a transition to democracy in those countries rather than going and overthrowing hostile dictators in the region. And when Qaboos died, there was no discussion at all about, okay, perhaps now we need a democratic opening in Oman. Within hours, Boris Johnson was flying out there to help install his unelected successor. So they really want to continue business as usual. And it's because of the part of the world Oman's in, with the Straits of Hormuz and all the, I think about a third of the world's oil supply each day is shipped out through this narrow stretch of water between Oman and Iran, that it's just seen as the only way the Foreign Office can imagine that this oil supply is safe is to have a friendly dictator on at least one side. In the 70s when the Shah was still in power, they had a friendly dictator on both sides.
There's a book by David Wearing. We've interviewed David on the show, Anglo-Arabia, I think it's called. And David came on. You can find the interview we did on our YouTube channel. And the way he communicated it was just so sublime. If you look at these countries on the Arabian Peninsula, Oman, Yemen, UAE, Kuwait, slightly different, Bahrain, Qatar, there's a lot of little small countries there. Why is that? And he said it's entirely a result, really, of Britain trying to carve out puppet regimes because they were concerned about the French having access to India through the Strait of Hormuz, and in the 19th century. And this was seen as France's way of accessing the Indian Ocean, and that couldn't be allowed to happen. So you have these puppet regimes. You think, my God, there are half a dozen countries which are only there on the map because of Britain trying to undermine the French 2 centuries ago. And we're still propping these people up.
Absolutely.
It's sort of mind-boggling, isn't it?
Yeah, and if they're not worried about the French, then it'll be the Russians, now it's the Chinese. There's always some kind of justification that the Foreign Office will find for doing this. But as I was writing the book, one of the techniques that I wanted to use in the book to make it more readable, so it wasn't just declassified files, was to try and set the scene and bring it to life. So Every year the Foreign Office has an open day. It's like part of this open house thing. So you can go inside the Foreign Office and wander around and kind of get a sense of the building where the people who write these files, where they work in. Because I think that's quite telling in an institution to see what their office is like. And I went there and they have this thing called the Durbar Courtyard, which is this enormous courtyard with a glass roof in the middle. And it's ringed by these statues of former colonial administrators in India, but not just colonial administrators, former East India Company commanders. And they even have a room where they have the chair, like the furniture, of the East India Company chairman that's still preserved as kind of on display and something that they're very proud of. So it's kind of no wonder that the Foreign Office is still supporting mercenaries and has this kind of, 17th century approach to international relations when the building where they work in every day is, a shrine effectively to the East India Company, which were the British mercenaries par excellence from their point of view.
Before we go to questions, and by the way, you're watching Tisky South's Novara Media. If you like what you're watching, we'd love to do more content like this. It's great to be part of the news cycle, to impact the conversation around a particular topic on the day, or Labour Party politics or the Democratic Party. But this is how we started, talking about big ideas, and British foreign policy is about as big as it gets, and the work that Phil's done, amongst others, invaluable. If you want to see more of this stuff, click the subscribe button. Helps us a lot. And also, let's see how many people are watching. We've got 700 people watching, but we've only got 256 thumbs up. So it doesn't cost you a penny. Just like manners, it's free. Hit the thumbs up button. Like I say, share the show onto the hashtag Tisky Sour. The link is in the description. It takes it to a bigger audience. We'll go to questions in 5 minutes. You may have seen at the beginning of the show the trailer. The older gentleman at the end of that trailer is a guy called Brian Batty.
Yeah.
Who is Brian Batty?
So Brian Batty was an SAS commander. He led a squadron in South Armagh at the height of the Troubles that was involved in quite an embarrassing incident where his men were arrested by the Irish police in the south for illegally crossing the border with firearms. And he had to go to court in Dublin to bail them out. And he said his men, who were supposedly in the most elite regiment of the British Army, had made a map reading error. So despite this, kind of what you would think would be a career setback, he ends up being the most senior KMS guy permanently stationed in Sri Lanka. He was he was certainly in touch with Sri Lanka's president, with the national security minister. He was very involved in the policy making and the operational side of things. So although he wasn't flying a helicopter or running a training camp, he had much more of an overview and kind of like some command level type role, it would seem from the files. And yeah, I thought, okay, this would be a really important guy to interview. Wrote to him asking if we get an interview, got no response. So then we sent a letter kind of saying, well, these are all the allegations that we're going to make about you in the film. And again, no response. And then we went to his house, and it was very strange because the front door was like slightly ajar. And we were knocking on the door and no one came. And then suddenly the upstairs window opens. And before I can say anything, this guy starts shouting at me to, bugger off, get off my land. And I sort of say, are you Brian Batty? Were you with Keenie Meenie in Sri Lanka? Can I ask you what you did there? Do you accept if you're responsible for war crimes there? He just keeps swearing at me, and then we sort of make our way off his property. So yeah, clearly he doesn't want to talk about what went on. But you can see from the declassified files just how sort of up to his neck he was in all of this.
Somebody else who might be worth interviewing by the authorities?
I think, someone as senior as him. I mean, I'm not, there's this kind of thing where like low-ranking people get kind of chased after. I'm not really kind of into that. But this was someone who was a lieutenant colonel when he left the British Army and went on, chose to get involved in this business activity at a very high level. And
looked like he had a very nice big house as well. It's not like he's not done badly out of it.
Yeah, I think he's done all right, but clearly, doesn't want to talk to journalists about what he actually did in Sri Lanka. Although there's a lot of evidence that suggests it wasn't too savoury.
Yeah, just a quick point of order. Apparently, war and conflict videos get demonetized on YouTube. You can partly understand why, I guess. But if you want to see more of this kind of content, go to support.novaramedia.com. We can only build this with your support. we've done pretty good things in the last couple of years. Not as good as Declassified, necessarily, if foreign policy is your kind of thing. They do great stuff as well. But everything we do, and I think we're probably just as good, if I'm honest. Everything we do is because of you guys, our supporters. So if you want to see more content like this is a podcast as well on iTunes, on SoundCloud. Go to support.novaramedia.com. We recommend an ongoing subscription of just 1 hour's work a week. So if you work and you earn more than a living wage, £10 an hour, why not £10 a month? That's sadly a couple of pints. I say that I was charged £6.50 for a pint the other day. So it's not even that. We really, really appreciate it. And if you just want to do a one-off payment, that's equally appreciated too. We're also going to take questions, not just in the live chat, but also on the hashtag Tysky Sour. So put them there as well. Right, so let's see what questions we've got going here. Virabin, I'm going to massacre these names, my apologies. Virabin Nandakumar asks, please talk about the disappearances at the end of the war. So I presume that's talking about Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
So the disappearances, what were these when the Sri Lankan Civil War?
So my bit focuses on the start of the conflict in Sri Lanka up until like 1989, but the war didn't finish until 2009. And, I said like in the period I was looking at, like a massacre of 85 people was a big deal. But in the last weeks of the war, there were reports that like 1,000 people a day were being killed. Many of these civilians, young children being killed by indiscriminate shelling. And there's been no kind of accountability for that genocide. I think what the book does is it helps to show like the pattern and the direction of travel, and also how the British government would respond to what was taking place. So a lot of people remember David Miliband went to Sri Lanka in 2009 and kind of made some appeal for an end to the bloodshed. But what they don't realise is that at the same time, the Foreign Office was sending out senior Northern Irish police officers as, quote, critical friends of the Sri Lankan forces to give them some kind of training. And that kind of behaviour, when you read my book, is like entirely predictable, because you see this duplicity. On the one hand, British politicians will say publicly, we respect human rights and international law, the right to self-determination, but then in private they will send out, the kind of the hard men of the British state to make sure that these movements don't succeed, often at terrible cost to human life. So I think, there's rightly been a lot of focus on the end of the war in Sri Lanka. I think this book, particularly for younger generation, helps kind of show the evolution of the conflict and how we got to that point, and also how Britain continued to support the violence throughout.
Matthias asks, what kind of mercenary/special forces stuff is the UK involved with today? Are they still targeting left-wingers? I guess a lot of the material from here you have access to because of the 30-year duration you have to wait for these files to be public. What stuff in 30 years' time will people be reading about that's presently ongoing?
Yeah, I think we'll find out a lot more about Britain's role in Yemen. So obviously there's a lot of focus on the arms trade. There's been some reporting about like special forces, SBS, being out there. And there was a US company called Spear Operations Group, which were kind of exposed for being out there. I think we'll find out a lot more about our involvement in Yemen, probably also in places like Mali, Libya. But a lot of what British special forces do now is kind of, they'll train like proxy militias. And because the SAS is still so secretive compared to like US special forces, there's still a lot of kind of deniable operations that the special forces can do, and there's no kind of there's no parliamentary oversight. I mean, you can say what you want about select committees, but the Defence Select Committee, the chairman of it, who's a Conservative, has said, we have no oversight over the special forces. So there's a whole part of the British military that is just opaque. You can't make freedom of information requests about it.
And what would they be? What would they be doing over there, the SAS, SBS? Because obviously people always talk about the Iranian-backed Houthis. Nobody ever talks about British-backed, other than weapons, of course. Yeah,
it's an interesting comparison. So a lot of what they do is training like guerrilla groups. So if you've got a situation where there's like there could be, say, like a strong protest movement in a country, and it's kind of veering towards armed struggle. If the British Foreign Office, or MI6, think that armed struggle would be in their interests, then they're quite happy to send out the SAS to train up those units in how to use things. I mean, it can be anything from like radios, because on the battlefield, you need to be in touch with other units so you don't shoot each other. Also, so you can call in airstrikes. They might have people on the ground, guys on the ground who are guiding in airstrikes. So they can do a lot of stuff without necessarily fighting themselves. They can do a lot to build up the military capacity of a guerrilla group. Or if it's a ruler that they want to keep in power, like Keenie Meenie, they can help set up a special forces unit that it will use to go out and crack down on these guerrilla groups. So they've kind of got both options covered.
It sounds a bit like what the Iranians do, right? Sort of Iranians go look for favourable proxies and train them up and arm them. I mean, it sounds like Britain's doing something quite similar.
Yeah, I think this is the reality of international relations. I mean, if you do like an international relations degree, there's kind of like the liberal school of international relations where it's all about promoting human rights and a rules-based international order, or there's like the realist school, which is basically everyone's out for their own interests. And I think when you look more at declassified files and you see how diplomats really think, Britain, Iran, they will both pursue their own interests very ruthlessly.
It's kind of like a very much, I remember sort of when I was a graduate student, post-Westphalian thing was like something in the future, but this is very much in the here and now. Lee Zowers asks, how much were Labour governments involved in these kinds of undertakings, or how favourable were they to this incipient private security industry? And Almus Quatch asks something similar. Were New Labour as involved in this as the Conservatives? So I suppose two questions there. What were the differences between the Tories and Labour in the 70s? And what were the differences between the Tories and Labour in the early 2000s, late 1990s?
Yeah, so I think Harold Wilson was definitely uncomfortable with this private security industry that was taking shape. And he probably came the closest to banning it. And that ban would have kind of stopped Keenie Meenie before it really got started. But that Labour government under Wilson and Callaghan were paying Keenie Meenie directly to guard bodyguards in different embassies. So the early contracts were from Labour governments. And so, I mean, something that Mark Curtis, my editor at Declassified, is very good at showing is how both under Labour and Conservative governments in the post-World War II period have been involved in supporting repressive regimes around the world. I think, when you get to New Labour, obviously the invasion of Iraq kind of triggered like a new dawn for private military companies going out to Iraq, also in Afghanistan. And that triggered some debate about regulating, particularly because of what Blackwater did. My understanding is that there was some kind of green paper put forward, but then David Miliband stopped short of actually implementing that into law. So there's now it's kind of like a voluntary code of conduct. So this was when Miliband was foreign secretary, so I think 2008, 2009. I need to check the dates. But yeah, certainly there was because of Iraq, the private military industry boomed. There was a backlash to that. And then rather than kind of using that backlash to put in anti-mercenary laws, David Miliband stopped short of doing that and has kind of allowed it to continue in this kind of self-regulatory sphere.
This is sort of bringing two questions together. This is from DWC 1964, who says, what can we, regular people, do about all this? BGM Mugridge asks, what can citizens in the UK do to help investigate the war crimes of PMCs? You can clarify what PMC is in a second. Should we look out for anything regarding people we might know? And how would we know? I suppose, how do you keep a foot of the developments? What files are being declassified? Are there notifications or something like that? And then I suppose, so how can you keep informed and what can you do?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I wanted to do with the book. I mean, it's a horrible, gruesome topic, but I don't want people to feel overwhelmed by it. There's not much. There's a lot of focus on US foreign policy, but there are very few people doing critical research on British foreign policy. And as a British person, I feel it's my responsibility, and it makes more sense to scrutinise what my government and British companies are doing. And also, the benefit of that is that it's the people involved are here. So there's more, in terms of trying to get accountability, it's in this country. But I think, on Sunday at this event with the Tamil community, I'm kind of looking forward to hearing from them what their ideas are about, whether they want to do a campaign or how they might try and organise to both get accountability and stop something like this from happening again. And anyone can go. I mean, it's easier if you live in London, of course, but the National Archives are in southwest London in Kew. Their inventory is online, so you can search by country. And generally now stuff from the 1980s is available. There's some stuff from like John Major's government as well that's coming out. And they're moving towards like a 20-year rule. So supposedly files will be declassified sooner, although there's a lot of kind of feet dragging.
When did that law come in about declassification of documents from 30 years ago?
Yeah, so there's a...
Was it New Labour?
Well, no. I think it was Public Records Act 1967 or 68.
So it's got nothing to do with freedom of information and the changes around that?
Well, no. So in 2010, there was a law that changed the 30-year rule to a 20-year rule that Cameron passed as part of his transparency agenda. Which kind of supposedly accelerated the declassification. But yeah, I mean, freedom of information is very important as well because there's still files that they won't declassify, so then you have to make a freedom of information request for those files. Right. Often a lot of the decisions to keep files classified are made by former diplomats who, in some cases, wrote the file that they're then refusing to declassify. So they're huge like conflicts of interest in this process. But sometimes you get a lot of information.
You get lucky a few times in the book, don't you? You talk about sort of somebody's redacted something and then they've left something at the bottom and it's...
Yeah, people are only human, so they make mistakes. And yeah, they might not remember to redact everything.
This from Tamils for Corbyn. They say, thanks for bringing our friend Phil's amazing work, a decade's worth, to your broad audience. Our pleasure. I guess maybe, it's not my role because I can't commission articles, but it would be good if you could maybe write something for us about what books people could read in this area. For people watching, what sort of... Because life's too short to read too many books, unless you're people like us, sort of it's your life to research, write, talk. What 2 or 3 books would you really recommend for people to get to grips with British foreign policy since the Second World War, and sort of private sort of military-industrial complex, private security companies, etc.? What are the kind of the standout books for you?
Yeah, I guess for me, the books by Mark Curtis, who I now work for, are really good. He kind of showed me what was possible to get at the archives. So he's got a couple of books. Secret Affairs, Britain's Collusion with Radical Islam is a very good one for understanding the war on terror. And he's got earlier books as well, like Web of Deceit. Also, Ian Cobain has done some great books. Cruel Britannia looks at Britain's use of torture, going right back to World War II. And someone like Anne Cadwallader has written a book called Lethal Allies about Britain's kind of dirty war in Northern Ireland. And in terms of the Tamil struggle, there's some great Tamil authors. So there's a woman called Dr. Malathi in New Zealand who survived the end of the war in Sri Lanka, and she wrote a fascinating book about what life was like under the Tamil Tigers when they had this period where they controlled their own affairs. They had this kind of autonomous zone for several years before the war kind of overwhelmed it all. And stuff by Sivanandan, who was the director of the Institute of Race Relations. He sadly passed away, but there's a whole repository of work there. He had this saying, "We are here because you were there and still are there," which was kind of like a guiding principle for some of my work to kind of show how Britain is still involved in former colonies. So yeah, that's 5.
That's great. No, I've read Mark's books, but not the other ones. That's excellent to see. Final question. George Turner asks, has any more information come to light since publication as a result of recently declassified files? Or is there anything worth looking out for in the future? If so, how? So the stuff you talk about here with Nicaragua, with Oman, with Sri Lanka, has anything new happened? Or is there anything around the corner you're expecting? Any sort of scoops in the next 6 months, year?
Yeah, there's going to be more. Keep an eye on declassifieduk.org. Some more stuff being declassified, and also kind of the more I talk to people about it, I get more understanding. So I'm going to do something about the UN Convention Against Mercenaries, which was signed in 1989. Britain didn't sign it. I'm going to do a story about why Britain hasn't signed that treaty. That's based on declassified files. And there's also a bunch of cases that I've got with the Information Commissioner for files that I wasn't able to get declassified in time for my book. But hopefully in the months to come, that will lead to more stuff being released.
Somebody's saying here, Hamja Hassan saying that Curtis gets some things wrong in the collusion book. Well, we're going to have him on. Hopefully you should watch that. Not you can. You should watch that and you can bring them up. Thank you, Viraben Nandakumar, for a £10 donation. Thank you, Tamas for Corbyn, £20 donation. Much appreciated. Finally, where can people keep up to date with your work, who you are, follow, etc.?
Yeah, so I'm now writing for Declassified UK, which is a new investigative journalism organisation. So the website is declassifieduk.org.
And your Twitter account?
My Twitter is pmillerinfo, and also the production company I work with is Yardstick Films, who will be releasing the documentary later this year about Keenie Meenie.
Fantastic. You've been great. It's a brilliant book, Keenie Meenie, out with Pluto Press. In major cities, you can probably buy it in most bookstores, I imagine.
Hopefully.
I mean, having a book out myself, with my book, Fully Automated Luxury Communism, in London, you go Waterstones, wow, it's got Pride of Place, and I go to Bournemouth, nowhere's got it. It's one of those things. However, independent bookstores are always best. If you can't do that, Amazon, nobody's going to blame you, but try and keep independent bookstores alive. I'll be back tomorrow talking to Anthony Lowenstein about the war on drugs, another fascinating topic. Phil, you've been fantastic.
Thank you.
This has been a great show. I'll see you again, same time, same place tomorrow. Good night.